In a number of my videos, I've told about mistakes I've made on the Appalachian Trail in particular, and in the outdoors in general. Now I'm going to talk about every mistake that I can remember, many of which incurred unpleasant results or the potential for unpleasant results. If we include mistakes both on and off the AT, I made one mistake that left me very embarrassed. I made one mistake for which I am deeply ashamed. I made one mistake that sent me to the hospital. And I made one mistake that could have turned into the last mistake I ever made. I will tell these stories here because they are cautionary tales, and I'm not talking about the specifics of each incident. Instead, I'm talking about what they have in common. I'm talking about the assumptions, inattention, failure to react, rationale, or lack of rationale that led to them. Most of the time, until these mistakes became obvious, I had thought everything was going just fine. And when it comes to entering the outdoors in general, and wilderness areas in particular, there often is no more beguiling assumption than the conviction that everything will be just fine. And here's another detail. I have been in the outdoors and wilderness areas off and on for decades, and those who know me probably would say I am experienced. Some might conclude that experience translates into a kind of license that means it's impossible for me to have serious trouble in the outdoors. That is a flawed assumption. Experience is valuable, yes. Experience can reduce the odds of trouble, but in the wilds, experience cannot guarantee everything. Everyone should carry a smartphone, and emergency signaling devices are a good idea, even if we carry them. The idea of immunity against serious trouble is still a flawed assumption. And, by the way, all of the mistakes I will describe here happened before everybody was carrying a cell phone. If we pay attention, we can find with depressing frequency news stories about hikers or those in the outdoors who went missing or had a dangerous episode. These stories often point out that the unfortunate individual had that, quote, outdoor experience. The suggestion of outdoor experience invites us to think that it's impossible for someone with outdoor experience to get into trouble or to disappear in the outdoors without some kind of foul play or sinister force at work. But after somebody gets into a terrible predicament, the only experience that might help is experience in dealing with terrible predicaments. This is a series of Google News alerts I received from October 13 to 16, 2023. They described 19 people who were lost or missing in 9 states or provinces. They also described 2 people who were injured and rescued, one in Ireland and one in Idaho. Every time I screwed up royally in the outdoors, I blamed myself. This was a blame that meant, you got yourself into this mess, Flatbroke. Let's see if you can get yourself out of it. One advantage of this attitude I have found is that it saves time, if nothing else. When something really bad goes down, we might want to cry. We might lose all confidence. Our morale might be shattered. But if we are far from towns and roads, we might have to deal with it all by ourselves. If a problem is bad enough, we won't even be able to quit and go home unless we deal with the problem first. We'll start my personal hit parade of screw-ups with a list of fairly mild ones. Mild in the sense that they were just something to put up with. Some of them I prefer to think of as gear experiments, even though they did turn into screw-ups. On my first Appalachian Trail hike, I carried a ceramic water filter, which worked very slowly. This photo shows me using it on that trip, not looking terribly happy about it. After that, I switched to Aquamira for all the section hikes that followed, which I find much easier to deal with. I've also carried a Sawyer Squeeze filter in addition on my last several section hikes. Here's a photo of a white blaze on the AT. But wait a minute, is it white or is it blue? I show it here because while it looks white, it really is blue. And blue blazes are for side trails. I once wandered 2 miles down a side trail before I got suspicious and got up close to examine a blaze, which in fact was a very light blue. Since then, I give blazes a close look when in doubt. Once on the AT, I jammed my Lexan spoon into a pot of rice or whatever it was that I was eating. I must have been hungry and eager to eat because the spoon snapped in two. To my surprise. Because I thought it was cool, I also was carrying a titanium spork, so I lived through it. Since then, I stick to titanium. I have fallen into creeks more than once, usually during the summer on a short trip close to home. I'm much more careful these days and usually test the footing with a trekking pole before I think about going into a creek. More than once, I pulled a rubber tip off of a trekking pole either by walking among rocks or sinking the pole deep into mud. These days, I keep the rubber tips in a fanny pack and put them on only when in town. This was one of my first homemade tents, and I was so proud of it that I used it on my very first AT section hike. I had used it close to home. Despite the fact that it wasn't made with waterproof sil nylon, it went through one light rain and all was okay. So I took it on the AT thinking everything would be fine. But no, on my last night I sat during a downpour that was so bad that when I peeked out the tent door, I saw a lightning bug get knocked out of a tree by the rain, and the poor guy hit the ground so fast he looked like a tracer bullet. My tent soon filled with mist from so much water hitting the fabric. Instead of pulling out my sleeping bag, I slept in a rain suit, and it was the last time I used a tent like that on the AT. I once bought a small camouflage shoulder bag at a discount store because it was cheap, and later I decided it would make a decent fanny pack for hiking. I sewed a belt onto it and thought it would work just fine, but I only sewed the belt on with a few stitches, and when I took it to the AT and buckled it around my waist, I discovered it was flopping all over the place as I walked. I ended up carrying it in the pack. Next is a list of definitely annoying screw-ups, the kind that weren't so easily shrugged off, but they weren't bad enough for my really nasty list. My first screw-up that rattled me badly happened when I was 13 years old. I had the idea to walk around a lake not far from my home, about a 10-mile round trip. I had assumed that a road circled the lake. I soon learned I was wrong. For about 3 miles, there was no road. I made the mistake of deciding to stick close to the lake shore, and before I was done, that idea had me wading through water above my knees, surrounded by tall cattails, and having to jump off a steep embankment about 5 feet high. Being 13 years old, I thought I would die before I got out of that mess. Still wet and muddy, I soon realized I could have walked through the trees, staying dry and keeping the lake in sight. I felt embarrassed and extremely stupid. It would be decades before I admitted to anybody that this had happened. One of my most boneheaded moves ever was the night I wandered away from my tent at night near the Appalachian Trail for a stand-up bathroom break, if you know what I mean, and I didn't take a light with me. I didn't take a light because I thought, I'll just go over there and everything will be fine. And it would have been, except I couldn't find the tent in the dark. After kicking myself for being so dumb, I calmed down and thought about my predicament for a minute. I looked around and noticed a tree, which despite the dark, I could tell was far taller and thicker than most in the immediate vicinity. This was a lucky break, I decided, because if I counted my steps and watched my turns carefully, I could walk from the tree in one direction and return to the tree if that wasn't where my tent was. Then I could try again. On the second try, I found the tent, which was lucky. I still consider it extremely lucky. It was warm that night, and I probably could have sat down under a tree and fallen asleep and waited for daybreak, but I'm glad I didn't have to. After that, I never took 2 steps in any woods without taking my fanny pack, which always contains at least 1 light. And if I decide to leave the tent in the dark, I leave a light burning at the tent. On an early AT section hike, I didn't wear any underwear because it was very hot. I sweat a lot, and I figured I would be covered up decently, so what the hell. I soon discovered, however, that no underwear meant ticks had a clear path to that area where the underwear would have been, and that is where they headed. I got rid of them and went back to wearing underwear. On my first AT section hike, I wore tall leather boots and heavy, thick socks. Such footwear had worked fine when I was on a long backpacking trip in New Mexico when I was 14 years old. In Virginia in the summer on the AT, they were not such a good idea. My feet sweat badly in them, and by day 2, I had multiple blisters. Lucky for me, I had brought along white medical tape so I could cover the blisters, and I had to air dry my feet and socks out a few times each day. After that, I wore only rugged but low-cut shoes and thin socks, 2 socks on each foot. I've always done year-round walking and hill climbing to stay in shape for section hikes. One year, however, all I did was riding a bicycle and running uphill, and when I got on the AT, my feet, ankles, and lower legs were not up to the job. They got sore quickly and stayed sore and slowed me down. This meant for me that staying in shape for the AT requires a lot of walking, fast walking, about as fast as I can walk. That's what it takes to keep my ankles, feet, and lower legs in shape for walking on the millions of rocks on the AT. Because on those rocks, my feet and ankles often are forced into odd positions, the likes of which they would never experience when walking on nothing but level ground. During one of my early section hikes, I injured a leg by jumping a couple of feet off of a rock while wearing a loaded pack and trying to land on one foot. One might have thought that taught me a lesson, but more than a decade later, I pretty much did the same thing. The first time it happened, my foot turned when I landed, leaving me with a sore ankle for the rest of the hike. If anybody has stepped off of a curb when distracted and not expecting to step off of a curb, they probably know the jolt that results when the foot lands several inches lower than we were expecting. One night I was alone at an AT shelter. The platforms of these shelters are often 2 feet or more above the ground. This particular shelter had a flat-topped rock about 10 inches tall, conveniently placed next to the platform for a step. So, yet again in the dark without using a light, I stepped off the platform, thinking I would use the rock step. Except the rock step was not under my foot. One leg hit the ground 10 inches lower than I was expecting. As a result, about half of one leg was hurting, and it stayed that way for the rest of the hike. The leg felt stiff as a board every morning when I woke up, so I had to spend a few minutes limping around trying to limber it up. After that experience, I paid a lot more attention to what I was doing with my feet. My daughter once went on an AT section hike with me. We covered 50 miles. By the second day, she was complaining that one of her big toes was rubbing against the inside of the top of her shoe. I wish I could say what I was thinking when I heard this news, but the sad fact is I wasn't thinking at all. I might forgive myself if that lapse had only lasted 10 minutes, but no, every day she complained about that toe, and I did nothing. I had a hard time understanding why one toe was rubbing the top of the inside of the shoe. It didn't occur to me that the toe might get worse. This bewilderment of mine was both a waste of time and a distraction. As the hike neared its end, the toe was looking worse, and still I did nothing. When she got home, she saw a podiatrist, had the toenail removed, and wore a bandage for a week. If I had needed damning evidence that I completely fell asleep at the wheel, this was it. With the clarity of hindsight, I can see we should have immediately wrapped that toe with white medical tape, which I always carried. And if that had failed to stop the problem, I should have cut a hole in the shoe where the toe was rubbing. Years later, I asked her a question, that if I had said we should tape the toe and cut a hole in the shoe, would she have agreed? And her answer was, hell yes. As a result of all this, she lost interest in long-distance backpacking, and the only one to blame is me. And years later, as if it was a reminder of how badly I had screwed up, my big toe wore a hole in a shoe on the AT. I have said repeatedly in these videos that the Appalachian Trail is a relatively safe place, in particular compared to some areas we could visit for an outdoor adventure. And as it turns out, when I really hurt myself and put myself in serious jeopardy, I had to go hunting to do it. The first incident occurred in a national forest in Ohio, when I had been a bow hunter for 19 years. When I made these trips, I backpacked in, lived out of my tent, and would stay there for days at a time. I was using a bow and arrows I had made myself, and I was traveling light. Hunters, if they have enough money, can avail themselves to an almost limitless number of different products designed for every function imaginable. Being frugal, or dumb, or both, I usually went with the cheapest expedient I could come up with. And on this particular trip, I was carrying an arrow quiver just like this one, hooked to a belt around my waist. Hunting arrows, for those who don't know, have sharpened blades called broadheads on the tips. And the number one rule of an arrow quiver is that it has to be thick enough or tough enough or otherwise designed to keep a broadhead from cutting through it. One day in that national forest, I decided to break that rule. The quiver was nothing but fabric, but I told myself I had been hunting for 19 years. I knew how to be careful, or so I thought. So I grabbed my bow, put arrows in the quiver, and started walking away from my tent. And literally 2 minutes later, as I was walking uphill, I slid backward slightly. The back end of one arrow bumped against a tree, a broadhead cut through the quiver, and went into the back of my right calf. I rolled up my pants leg, and it only took one look to see that this was a wound that I could not take care of by myself. I wrapped a bandana around my leg, zipped up my stuff in the tent, and immediately walked to my car. It was a roughly 10-minute drive to a nearby town, and again, this was before everybody had a cell phone. I knew where a fire department substation was in the town, so I headed there. I got no answer when I knocked on the doors, but luckily, a police officer pulled over to see what the hell I was doing. He gave me directions to a nearby hospital, and I got stitched up in the emergency room. By this time, I had had enough of the woods for one day, and I drove home. The next day, I returned to the tent with a friend so he could carry my stuff out as I limped alongside. If I hadn't been so arrogant and stupid, I could have slipped a plastic container, thick enough to contain any broadhead, inside that flimsy quiver. Here is a replacement quiver, just like the original, and the plastic container I put inside it, and the arrow I stabbed myself with. I guess I rigged up this replacement quiver to soothe my bruised ego, but the fact is I never hunted with such a thing ever again. I carry homemade quivers made from PVC pipe. They are tough enough to withstand being thrown into a car trunk or into the corner of a tent, and they have lids that keep out the rain. And now at last, the most dangerous mess I ever got myself into. Long ago, over the span of 2 years, I went black bear hunting by myself in Ontario for 5 weeks. This was before non-resident hunters were required to use a guide or outfitter. At the time, you could buy a hunting license for 25 Canadian dollars at a store. And in Ontario, 87% of the entire province is Crown land, basically public property. At the time, it was open to a non-resident bear hunter. During that 5 weeks, I hunted by myself, slept in a tent or in my car, and saw wildlife and animal behavior I'd never seen before. Despite that, however, there was one bad day. On that morning, I stepped into the woods on the east side of this power line, and I got lost in several thousand acres of trees on flat ground. I got lost because I wasn't paying too much attention to what I was doing, and I wasn't paying too much attention because I thought I had a compass in my pocket. But no, the compass was in my car. When I checked my pockets, I found nothing. Immediately, I thought of two things. One was an American bear hunter who got lost in that immediate vicinity the year before. At the time, almost every day, the Canadian bear guide drove his truck past my campsite on a logging road. On a day in early May, when it had snowed an inch overnight, he told me an American hunting with another guide was missing. He told me this so that if I spotted the man or heard him yelling, I could retrieve him. The missing man would have spent the previous night in the snow, in the woods, in freezing weather. The next day, the guide told me searchers found the man's rifle. The next day, the guide told me searchers found the man's body. I also thought about a film that I had seen shown at an outdoor club meeting I had attended. It depicted how some people behave when they are lost. They can walk in circles, run in panic, and become so traumatized that they will hide from anyone they might see. I don't remember who made the film, but I looked for it on YouTube and I cannot find it. The people searching for that lost hunter the year before obviously found his rifle first because he threw it to the ground. And if he did that, he probably was running. So, standing there and realizing that I was good and lost, I had to admit I had an urge to run. I also knew that most certainly it would not do me any good at all. The sun was out, shining through the treetops. I knew that if I could figure out where west was, I could make it back to the power line. There are, as many people might know, instructions on how to find north using a watch and the sun. However, at that time, I wasn't able to remember those instructions, and I'm not sure how many people could remember those instructions unless they were carrying them with them written down. I took a look at my watch. It was 11 a.m. I was a member of a science club in high school, and as a result, I knew that at noon, shadows will always be pointing north or very close to it virtually every day of the year. This, by the way, is true north of the Tropic of Capricorn in the northern hemisphere. All of this, however, did not come to me in a flash. I had to sit down and draw a diagram in the dirt to make sure I was remembering it right. So, to head west, I had to keep the sun just behind my left shoulder and start walking, which I did. And as it turned out, I was walking dead west. The only glitch is that the shortest direction to the power line was southwest. I didn't know that at the time, and it didn't really matter, because if I was going west, I was going to hit the power line, which I did. I made it back to my car, and within an hour, the sky turned overcast, and it stayed that way for 3 days. Had I not walked out when I did, whatever would have been left of me might still be laying up there. And there's a postscript to this story. A year or two later, I was back in Ontario working as a volunteer for my friend, the bear hunting guide. We would place hunters in tree stands in the late afternoon and tell them to stay there, no matter what, until we returned to get them after nightfall. There were many tree stands, and it took a 15-mile drive on dirt roads to reach all of them. At one stand, again well after dark, the hunter told us he had hit a bear. Because bears usually don't go far before lying down to expire, the guide, his helper, myself, and about 6 other guys went into the woods to see if we could find it. So we were stomping around with our flashlights shining all over the place. The guide soon decided we would have to try again in the morning, so we turned around to go back to the trucks. After a couple of minutes, the guide stopped in his tracks and announced that we were going in the wrong direction. By this time, needless to say, I wasn't about to forget what I had learned when I got lost. Before we went into the woods, I looked at my compass. We went south to enter the trees, and now we were going north. I told the guide I had used my compass, and I promised we were going the right direction. We took about 20 more steps and found ourselves on the road next to the trucks. We were less than 20 yards away from the trucks, and the guide was convinced we were going the wrong way in the dark. And after that, he wore a compass on a lanyard around his neck every day. And now we're once again done. I have an account on Twitter, or whatever the heck it's called these days, where I post news about the outdoors. The link is in the description. On my channel page, I have a number of playlists containing more than 80 videos describing a variety of topics on how to keep ourselves out of trouble and keep moving along trails like the AT. And as always, thanks a million for watching.